Good morning, everyone. I'd now like to call to order the meeting of the Human Resources, Governance and Stakeholder Relations Committee of Waterfront Toronto. I've been advised that a quorum is present and it's appropriate to proceed. Firstly, I'd like to welcome all of you who are joining our meeting today. I'd also like to remind you that the open session of today's meeting is being recorded and will be posted for the public to view. And before we get into the business of the meeting, has Joe Mihovic joined the meeting yet?
He has not.
Okay,
He has not. So you might hold that comment till
I
later.
think we will hold our thanks because it's been really a pleasure to have him serve on the board with us. And so we will come back to a special thank you to Joe. So before we get into the business of the meeting, as is our custom, we will commence with a land acknowledgement. Waterfront Toronto acknowledges that the land upon which we are undertaking our revitalization efforts is part of the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. In addition, Waterfront Toronto acknowledges that Toronto has historically been a gathering place for many Indigenous people, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples today. So I think we would move to the first item of the business, and it's the approval of the meeting agenda. May I please have a motion to approve the agenda for the meeting? Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Raul. Any discussion? So moved. And so let's move to declaration of conflicts of interest. Any conflicts of interest to be declared? Nope. None declared. We can now move on to the business of the meeting. Thank you. So we are on the consent agenda. So the first item of business is the approval of the minutes of the open session of September 15th, 2022.
So moved.
Thank you. So I think that's Paul and then Raul. Any discussion? Okay, so moved. Thank you. And now as our practice, the meeting materials contain an update on ESG matters. And so Lisa Taylor will briefly speak to this. Otherwise, we will take it as read. Lisa?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Wendy, it hasn't been that long since we provided our last update. We've continued progressing the key initiatives under this update in the last 2 months. So I'm happy to take it as read and just note that we are planning for a comprehensive board level update on ESG in early 2023.
Thank you. Any questions for Lisa? Raul?
Quick question. And first of all, Lisa, once again, thank you for doing this. I think this is great to link this all to the UN SDGs. 2 quick questions. Just a little bit of an update from your standpoint on where we are on the scope 3 and the progress, because I know that's a huge issue, not only for us, but in the corporate governance world largely. And linked to that too would be the climate action plan. And I know you'll brief us more in detail in January, but where are we right now in your mind on both of those?
So on the scope 3 emissions, which is that scope 3 is the indirect emissions from our supply chain. So most of that relates to the construction work that we do, most notably with the Portland Flood Protection Project being our largest project. So we've been working with Alison, our construction manager for the PLF project, to get some data on what the scope 3 emissions are from construction. So I think we have data now for the first 2 quarters of this year. So that's in progress. And when we do update the board in early 2023, we may have something that we can actually report on related to that. But the plan is to have that completed by the end of this fiscal year and incorporate the results in our integrated annual report for the year end.
Okay, and anything on the climate action plan?
So on the climate action plan, what I've listed in this dashboard outlines the 4 priorities that are the pillars of our plan at the moment, which is exploring a net zero target for Waterfront Toronto, looking at green procurement and how we can incorporate that, stakeholder engagement and overall governance in terms of how we oversee the climate action plan. And that's going to be part of the update to the board in early 2023, exactly that, the elements of that plan and getting feedback from the board on it.
Super. Wendy, can I just offer a suggestion? This is all good
Yes,
stuff.
absolutely.
Perhaps as we start to think about an agenda for our next board retreat, I know we'll have a whole bunch of items we might want to put on it. I think this would be particularly interesting, the SDGs, and in particular the Scope 3 and the Climate Action Plan. And the reason I say that is it's going to be increasingly relevant to all organizations out there. And the Scope 3 is a very difficult area. And if we're actually making progress on this thing, I think the board would benefit from understanding how we manage to narrow that focus and actually make progress, because a lot of people are feeling quite overwhelmed by this right now. So I know as we build up, we'll have other agenda items potentially too, but this I think would be good, at least keeping on the list for discussion.
Very good. And Lisa and George, any comments?
No, the only thing I would say is, I think what Lisa was saying is we'll be sharing what our strategy is and not necessarily what the results are for those measures at this point in time.
Yeah.
Oh.
I got that, George. Yep.
Yeah, well, it's part of two
Yeah.
results in terms of what the emissions are right
Yeah,
now
yeah.
from our construction activities and how we can reduce those
Yeah.
emissions, you know.
Yeah, so it's a
You know,
strategy that we'd be reporting.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yes, and you know what? The other thing I shared with Steve is we don't necessarily have to wait for a half day or single day strategic board meeting. If we get through some of the major items that we're dealing with now, it might give us a little more latitude to incorporate a little more strategic time in future board meetings. So we should definitely just put it on the parking lot to address after January, and then just figure out when the right time is to get into a deeper discussion.
I think that sounds like a very good recommendation, George, because I do find, and I was just wondering about the rest of the committee, I find this dashboard approach that Lisa's doing is very helpful.
Yeah, no, they've done a great job, so.
Okay. Any other discussion? Okay, so then we will move to, thank you, Lisa, and we'll move to item 5 on the agenda, the Human Resources Report from Rose.
Thank you, Wendy. Well, good morning again, everyone. And I know we have a lot on the agenda today, so I promise to keep it brief. I'll just provide a few highlights for Q2, which was the July to September period. The KPIs are there in the report. Just a couple things. I'm not going to go through every single quadrant like I typically do, but I'm happy to take any questions at the end. We saw an increase in vacation time over Q1. Not surprising, it was the summer months. Our sick time decreased, which is also a good thing, shows employee well-being, strong well-being, and commitment to motivation. The employee satisfaction, we have a very low turnover rate of 2%, lower than Q1. In fact, when I looked at the numbers, it's the lowest percentage of any Q2 over the past 4 years. We're pleased to see that this average is staying low. And our employee development measures dollars spent by employee, and that's slightly gone up since the last period. Just a quick update on recruitment. I'll just go over everything and then take questions if that's all right with the committee. The numbers are there in the report, but there's just a couple things I want to comment with recruitment. Despite labor shortages across all sectors and in this current economy, we've successfully hired and onboarded 8 new staff during this last quarter. However, we've been experiencing longer than usual recruiting times, not only due to the labor shortages, but also because of the corporation's salary freeze over the last 4 years. This has resulted in our compensation not being up to date to current market. This has affected our ability to recruit top talent to have higher salary expectations than our budgets will allow. This supports our need to prioritize our salary benchmarking exercise to ensure our competitiveness when recruiting. And I'm happy to say we started the salary benchmarking exercise with an external consultant, and we will be reporting back in March at the March meeting. George, did you want to add anything right now?
Yeah, I think, there's 2 issues that I identified in, the session on succession planning, but also on the HR. There are 2 things at senior recruitment level. Until we resolve the issue of our mandate extension, nobody wants to leave a high-paying job to come here to be let go. So that's a critical factor for us to deal with, and I'll speak to that probably in directors only. But as Rose said, one of the things we're confronting, we just did some management, lower level management, manager positions. Our top 4 candidates refused to take anything below what we currently pay the mid-level of a director. So we can't compete. We have to obviously recalibrate some of those positions, and I'm not going to do it without having good data. So we're doing the external benchmarking survey that we will share with the board. I'm clearly going to have to adjust at least some of those positions. We'll see how we compare before I make any recommendations on adjustments. But we can't even hire the people that are doing the day-to-day work at the management and lower management levels, and that's creating a real problem for us.
Questions?
Sure. Is there a question, or?
Yes, it's Joe Mihevik here.
Hi, Joe.
Hi, thanks. Finally figured out how to get in. Apologize for the tardiness for that. How much are we just off by, say, back of envelope on a percentage basis?
In terms of what the salary benchmarking, are you saying, or?
Yeah. If you were to spitball it I know the study needs to be done, but
yeah. So well,
give
the example
sure.
on this one and
sure,
say what they were asking for and what we.
Absolutely, Joe. I don't want to mislead the committee or anyone, so I'd be hesitant to put a number out, but I can give you an example. We were trying to recruit for, as George said, a manager level, project manager level. And typically our ranges go for that role between 89 to 128, hypothetically. But they were requesting, all 4 top candidates were requesting at least 110 to 140 as a base salary. We can't compete with private sector. Our salary band's really off. I don't believe so, but we, as George said, without raw data, in order to back up our services, we can't. I would not feel comfortable putting something out there, but there's a real example.
The other thing, Joe, is as infrastructure money and other government subsidy or supports start coming out, everybody's going to be competing for the same people. And that's one of our challenges too, is we can't keep up with what others are offering. And it's also one of our challenges on diversity, because everybody's going after, a small group of very qualified, diverse candidates. And when it gets into a bidding war as an agency, we can never compete. So we're going to have to find, the one benefit we do have and how we've retained people, and people love working here. So, we have that advantage. That's why we have a low turnover right now. But at a certain point, we're going to have some challenges because people start to see a bigger and bigger gap. They may rethink what their career looks like.
Yeah, I think we're finding, this is anecdotal, of course, the same thing in the city of Toronto on the planning side, project manager side. The private sector is just taking them all. all the bright lights or many of the bright lights have left for that.
Yes.
And Joe, that's exactly where this example came from, our development side of the world. And also in planning and design development, even in our project management, we just hired a manager and we had to come up quite a bit, and it was a strong candidate. I'm happy to say it was a woman engineer. So that's fantastic. It'll shake up our team. We had to come up a bit and it was hard.
And the other thing, as you would remember, I came back to get a few additional tools to deal with some inequities. So I appreciate both the board and the committee's support for that. The problem is we haven't really raised the base salary budget enough to compensate for that. So I'm not going to come back until I have good data on benchmarking, and I'll come back with a strategy to discuss with the committee.
Thank you, George. We also have a question from Raul and one from Leslie, please. Raul?
Sure, it's a little bit more of a comment, which is if we wait to do all of the benchmarking and we sort of stick to the traditional process, and we run the risk of some of these roles being slowing down for corporate performance is where I'm really going here. So George, we sort of be looking into a little signal from you for the lapses here, are they impacting crucial areas of the organization? I saw there are 14 out of 94 FTEs that are vacant. And maybe Rose, you can give us a little bit of a snapshot on what areas those were in. And the conversation I'm trying to avoid having is the one at the end of the year that says, gee whiz, you know, we're going to be 18 months behind on this because we couldn't find the people because we didn't have the budget to go pay for them. Because if that's where this is going, we need to have sort of a different conversation now, so we don't end up with the problems around corporate performance later.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair comment. It's been a concern. We've been trying to use other strategies. We're bringing in contract people, fee for services, current plugs to make sure we're moving. But here's the dilemma. If there's two dilemmas. If I make an adjustment now, for example, on that project manager, they would be making more than the directors that I've had here for a while, right? So then I'd have to ask for even more. I don't have that in the budget now. Like, we've maxed out our budget for next year pretty well. So we're right now having that discussion. I've been talking to Lisa and to Rose about, you know, what do I need to do to keep us, you know, not falling behind on any of the priorities. So I will, you know, when we meet as a board in December, I might have a little more report back on, but I agree with you, Ruel. I may have to, you know, find a way to come back to this committee, and we may have to call a special meeting, just a short one, to make a recommendation to the board to give me a little more flexibility before the end of the year so that I don't lose people. But I've been definitely conscious of that, Ruel. I can tell you that, and we're using strategies to plug until, you know, the one thing, it's like a hydraulic. If I push on one, something else pops up, and then I got to deal with that. So I'm trying to make sure whatever my solution is, understands the big picture.
Leslie?
So my, it's first of all, I'm not usually at this committee meeting, so thank you for indulging me in my question or comment. It's not really a question, it's sort of a comment. It's about the source or the pool from which we are recruiting. And I asked this question because just last week we hosted a meeting with the GTHA city managers and CEOs and introduced them to a number of organizations, not-for-profit organizations, so not executive recruiters, who have large pools of talent who are disconnected from the market. So this may not solve the dollar figure issue, but it's more about where are we casting our net to look for the talent ourselves. And there are, so I'll call less traditional sources, and I'm happy to, George, speak to you and find, because the city managers and CEOs, unlike yourself, like yourself, are facing similar challenges. Succession, being competitive in the market, and we had a really good discussion around a lot of opportunities that they because they're following the traditional way they've been recruiting, and so I'm not sure I think it's a suggestion, and I'd be happy to follow up with you on that, because it will also address a number of things. These organizations also are their networks and their reach is probably more diverse than we would normally be thinking. So just
you know what, Leslie, it's a great point. And I should tell you, as soon as I joined, that was one of my priorities. And I've been talking to Rose's group, but also each of the C-level candidates to make sure we're looking at non-traditional groups. We're also in the process of also reaching out to universities, different professional associations, different diversity groups. So I think we have more work to do on that, Leslie, for sure. So whatever the board can do to help us on that would be greatly appreciated, because that was part of our diversity strategy, not just the recruitment strategy. It was really to make sure we have a broader pool to pick from and to develop that pool over time as well. Happy to follow up with you after. That'd be great.
I would love to hear more, Leslie.
And can we send Leslie the confidential information that I sent out, please?
I think I got it.
Did.
Oh, you got it?
Yeah, I sent it to her.
Thank you.
Okay.
Before I go on, I think there's another question, right?
We also have another question from Jeannie, please.
Yeah.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thanks for
letting me join your meeting, Wendy. Yeah, I just want to echo what Leslie said. You know, we can't get into a salary war with the private sector. I come from the development world and salaries are bonkers. That's just not possible. But remember that, you know, I think with a growing number of workers, purpose is really important. And that's something that we have in spades at Waterfront Toronto, the purpose of our work. So perhaps in not only to echo what Leslie said, kind of where we're looking, but in terms of, you know, how we're positioning, you know, kind of what the position. I think that we really need to speak about all those other benefits. As you mentioned, George, people love working for Waterfront Toronto, love the mission, the purpose, and let's make sure that we that people understand that it's not just a job and collecting a paycheck. So
absolutely, and
we're not going to win the war on salaries at all.
Yeah, we're not going to compete, and we're going to have to compete on mission. And
purpose.
That's why,
people want to feel engaged.
Yeah,
they're doing something
mean.
meaningful versus instead of just kind of, you know, let's put up another condo and make a ton of money. So.
Well, and you'll see, you know, when we get into our baseline survey and the participation rates, and like people are very engaged in this organization and they love what they're doing and want to contribute to solutions. And if we get to, and this is why I want to get to the associations and to the actual university or college programs to introduce ourselves, because we may be able to attract them once they are aware of who we are and the opportunities there. So it has to be multifaceted. We're not going to solve this with one strategy.
And to Rahul's point, are there areas, George, where, you know, the work is not being done by the organization because there are vacancies, or are you just looking ahead?
We're not moving on some of the things, like, you know, we would like to get somebody who could help us with the renderings that, you know, we did for Quayside and some of the others. I mean, we're still doing that. Ray's helping us, but she doesn't have the people anymore, and we need to fill that. So we end up sometimes having to go outside consultants where we're paying way more. But we need to deal with a systemic. I can't pay one individual more than everybody else in that kind of category, unless we do kind of one-time bonuses. But you know, we need to kind of think this through. So the major projects are good. Some of the other activities to support them are slowing down, but they're not the critical activities.
Okay, thank you.
We've reallocated people to the priorities.
Thank you very much, everyone. Very good discussion. Can we move on to item number 6, Rose?
Wendy, I was just, if you will allow, I'll just finish a quick update on the HR.
Yes.
If you don't mind, I'm sorry. I'll leave the COVID stuff away. It's just we've come back 5 days over 2 weeks. We advised the team that system's in place. We removed some of our protocols relating to COVID-19, but more just on some general HR matters. And it's more for any of the committee members that are new to us. I just want a reminder about, remind this group about our performance management process, which we all call PFS. It's a really rigorous 3-step process. There's timing throughout the year. For example, step 1 is where we plan our individual goals and objectives, and that's usually done by June 30th. The feedback is a formal review process. It's done mid-year where we review. We typically can realign if something is off. That's done by October 31st. And then, of course, our year-end review, which is a formal check-in. How did we meet against goals set and what did we achieve? That's usually done by April, and then it comes to the HR committee, to the board. Our PFS process evaluates not just what we do, but how we do things, and that's really important. And this PFS process is very much a top up and a top down. It's a little bit of both. And of course, it starts, we all collaborate together. George gets his approved by the board chair, and then he approves the rest of the staff. George, did you want to add anything there?
Yeah, so we are just in the process. I've just completed my 6-month mid-year review with Steve. So Steve gets my draft performance, which really aligns to the priorities that are in the 5-year plan that the board has set. He reviews that, he approves it. I report back halfway through. He's shared with me the positives, some of the areas for improvement, just not for me, but for my staff. And then I make my commitment for the rest of 6 months as to what I'm going to do about that. And then he reviews that at the end. One of the things that I would probably ask, and I've told Steve, he's free to talk to anybody, my staff. And last year he picked 3 staff to see how they've enjoyed working for me or not, but also stakeholders. I said, talk to whoever. And definitely I have no problem sharing with the rest of the board or committee what's in my performance. So I've left that to Steve as to who he wants to engage and who he wants to share with, but we have that dialogue. It's benchmarked against the priorities the board itself set. And as I said, I'm open to any improvements in the process, but it's a pretty rigorous process internally. And happy to take any questions that the board
And
might have.
George, would you please add what the point that we were discussing on, I think it was Monday or Tuesday, in terms of the sort of mid-term review that we will do with the board and with Steve before he leaves in March?
Yeah. So usually we try to deal with all of the salary issues in June and performance. And I had strongly suggested to Steve that he talk to the board and share, either we move that discussion up at the end of March when he's leaving, or that at least he shares with the board and gets that input on my performance in particular, but also the rest of the group, so that the board has that feedback when we have the discussion. So we have two choices. We can move that up to the March meeting and deal with, because it might go to Rahul, your issue. I may not be able to wait too long to make salary adjustments that I need to make to keep us operational on the priorities. So, but either way, we should get Steve's feedback with the board before he leaves.
Any committee feedback on this? Is there general consensus around having the review from Steve at the March meeting prior to his departure? Any questions or discussion? No? Okay.
I think that would be a good idea. I'd like to see that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Rose. And so we still, just mindful of the agenda and our timing here, so we still have Rose,
Yep.
HR practices and policies.
Yep, I'll just quickly finish.
Thank
Just
you.
one thing. First recommendations that came out of the M&P report on DE&I was a workforce demographic survey. Also recommendations to work on our organizational values and our waterfront affirmation statement. All that work is underway, and you'll be hearing from George in a few minutes with an assist from our special guest, Sandra Portis from M&P, who's on the call in a few minutes. With respect to HR practices and policies, we've provided a listing of all our corporate guidelines. We've added, we've tried to streamline 4 guidelines. We were listening, some of our guidelines into one, and that's around respectful workplace. We also, thanks to Bill 88 that was passed in April, we prepared a guideline about disconnecting from the workplace and giving clarity and expectations to our staff about actually disconnecting. There's a lot in there. We're happy to share. And we're also just today launching the electronic monitoring guideline that needs to be out to staff. It's also part of Bill 88. We're in line. We review guidelines and update them to either new legislation or as required. That's all I need to say on there, and I'm happy to take questions. Sorry for rambling on.
No, thank you, Rose. Very good. Any questions for Rose? Okay, very good. So we will move to item 7 on the agenda, the stakeholder relations report. So I'd now like to ask Cameron to provide an update on the stakeholder relations.
Thank you, Wendy, and good morning. You've got tab number 7, the stakeholder relations update, and this report really flows from a discussion we had at the March 3rd meeting of this committee, where my colleague Ed Chalupka gave an overview of how the corporation interacts with governments. But we didn't at that meeting discuss the 3 other categories of stakeholders that we have in our kind of constellation, and those include Indigenous, local community, and issue-based stakeholders. So I just wanted to supply the directors with some context about how we're interacting with those communities. So you have the report, and I won't read it, but I would just alert you to 3 things. One is that the corporation, as you know, and we'll discuss this in due course, is engaging with governments, among other things, on its mandate renewal. We are of the view firmly that there's more work to be done on the waterfront, and we need to have clarity around our role going forward and under what terms and conditions. So we're spending a great deal of time with our government stakeholders on that matter. And now that the municipal election is over, we are, of course, focused on outreach to the new and re-elected city councillors and Mayor Tory. And as directors know, we've had a very constructive meeting with the 416 caucus. As to Indigenous communities, and I do think this relationship that we've built with MCF in particular is remarkable, and this will be going to farm in its materials, but Infrastructure Canada last week issued an evaluation, or at least posted it on their website, of the Portland's flood protection project. And in that, it concluded, and I'll just quote, Waterfront Toronto has developed expertise and knowledge in public engagement, and particularly in Indigenous engagement, and that demonstrate an interest and a commitment to developing inclusive and community-driven projects. Waterfront Toronto's Indigenous engagement may constitute a model to follow for future projects like the PLFP project. Its expertise in this area could continue to play an important role in future revitalization projects. So I thought that was a nice call out that they made in that report. And again, that will be brought forward to farm at its next meeting. We had, I would think, the busiest summer we've had in certainly a long time, certainly since I've been here, with pop-up engagements at festivals and farmers markets, and in co-sponsored events like the Smorgasbord over the summer, PLFP Science Fair at the Bentway, boat tours, all of which were delivered by Waterfront staff on weekends and evenings. There's a lot of commitment, as was noted earlier, by staff to show up and demonstrate the great work that the corporation's doing in terms of waterfront revitalization. And finally, we're regarded as a thought leader in several issue areas. That's the third kind of category of stakeholders, the issue stakeholders. And we've been invited to appear in a number of symposiums on topics like rehabilitating the Great Lakes, increasing housing supply, sustainable development, and delivering complex infrastructure projects, reducing flood risks, etc. We get a number of requests every week to appear and to participate in events. And so we are again seen as a thought leader. And as the report concludes, our refreshed purpose, as we just discussed, will give us an opportunity to reintroduce the corporation to all of our stakeholders and remind them why we exist and what we're trying to achieve, and find opportunities to align and partner with those. And I'd finally like to say that stakeholder engagement is a mainline management function here, and it's kind of part of our DNA. It's not something that's delegated to government relations or the sustainability team or anything. It's sort of in our DNA, and it's something that we take very seriously. So it's a collective effort that our colleagues all participate in.
So Wendy, if I could just add for 30
Yes.
seconds, those pop-ups are and the other engagement activities like the boat tours we've done are extremely helpful and successful in making people aware of who we are. They see some of the work that's being done. They have no idea who's doing it. And it helps to identify not only who we are, but what our bigger plans are. And I attended a number of those weekend boat tours and pop-ups, and we did a cleanup day where the neighbors in the neighborhood would engage us and first of all thank us for doing the cleanup, but then ask us who we are and find out more about ourselves. I think it's a lot of that, you know, kind of smaller. It's not the big digital media activity, etc. Is critical for building that relationship with the community, and is probably a little more effective, quite frankly, than just putting out reports or digital media reports. So I would just encourage us to continue to do more of that. And I think that's critical.
Thank you, Cameron and George. Any questions? Raul?
There we go. Good. So this is really helpful. I think you might have noted some time ago, we sort of asked, you know, as a part of our committee's title is Stakeholder Relations, and we were all kind of puzzled as to exactly which stakeholders we're talking about. So to get a frame like this is really helpful. And I read through this and I did note the way we've categorized the groups of stakeholders also makes a whole lot of sense. But it had me wondering just a little bit about the connection with our communications function in the organization. And where I'm going with this is, you know, George, you've mentioned a number of times in the past that one of our issues is trying to get people to understand what Waterfront Toronto is, the impact we're having in the broader community. And that seems to be through the comm side. And I'm wondering if there's a way, you might already be doing this, for us to sort of look at, you know, influencers, media, and others less as a sort of a group that we look through the comms lens with, and more as a group that we look through as a stakeholder group. You might be already doing that, but that didn't jump out at me when I read this report around stakeholder relations. So hopefully that makes sense.
I think it's the latter. I think we do that, and to give Cameron and his team credit, we look at who those critical partners are and how they can also be a voice for us, not just as influencers, but partners, right?
Right. So maybe I'd suggest then as we go forward that, yes, my point is that doesn't jump out when I'm reading the report, that the influencers, the people that are looked at as more as indie or urban related communications folks as a group doesn't seem to show up as a group within the stakeholder matrix. And I'm sure they're there in the communications one, but if the intent is, or if you're actually doing it as a part of the stakeholders, it'd be good to have that reflected in this just as we carry it forward.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And maybe I'll jump in on just a conversation I had with one of our developers yesterday, or 2 days ago. He did a tour of our flood protection project and was commenting on just how complex and how impressed he is in the complexity and the delivery, how we've been able to deliver this. And I did talk to the developer and said, look, we need voices like yours. Us talking about how good we are is not very helpful, right? It's self-serving in people's, but when you have industry leaders who do this and understand it, talking about how, complex and just how impressed they are, I said, we need your voice out there, because the more voices we have, the better the public and governments understand just how, complex the projects we take on are and how, quite frankly, how good the delivery's been. So we need to maybe take your advice for sure in terms of how we report this, but look at the other voices that we need out there other than ourselves talking about. And that's why we use third party, like the audit that Cameron referenced, pointing out this is a third party talking about not only how good the project is, but the involvement we've had with Indigenous and equity groups. So we need to use those third party voices more.
Thank you, Cameron and George. I think we have a question from Joe.
Yes, thank you very much for this helpful report. I'm wondering, are there any, noting that we need to renew our mandate, are there risks ahead? And maybe in answering that question, speak specifically, like there's a new kid on the block, at least a recent kid on the block, and that's CREATO. And
yeah.
So what's the division of labor between us and CREATO? And the city has a very obviously an uber strong role there, and here it's one of three. And so how does that relationship fit into this?
So Joe, Vic and I would talk. This has been an outstanding issue for some time. We originally, with Brian, the original CEO, had kind of set out a split of roles and responsibilities. Then the question became, well, let's not finalize that until we see what kind of government support we get by the other two levels of government, because if they're not in for more dollars, then maybe CREATO should take on more of that responsibility. So it's kind of been pushed aside. We continue to work together and deliver on our projects, and we try to help each other out. But the issue of finalizing roles and responsibilities has been kind of punted, although we've kind of set our interim roles and responsibilities and we're working to that. But to finalize that, I think they want to see what the other two levels of government are putting in before they decide how much the city should take over. The city, we can't do anything without city through approvals, and we pointed that out. City has total control at the end of the day, but the other two levels, obviously, you're going to have input if they have money in the game, right?
Right. It seems that's a relationship that needs to be understood, and it's part of the new ecosystem.
Yeah.
On the waterfront, and if it's I think it should. Well, I don't know. I'm just thinking a lot here. need to be addressed in the report to make sure that other orders of government see that we have the city piece well at hand, and we know what we're doing as Waterfront Toronto, and the city knows what it's doing with WTO.
Yeah.
And that you're not stepping on each other's toes.
No, and the MOU, the original MOU back in 2006 had allocated us leading on certain properties. So we continue to do that. And we'll update that. We have a city council resolution that has us coming back in the fall, clarifying this role.
Thank you.
Any other discussion? Thank you very much, Cameron. And we will now move to our item number 8, diversity, equity, and inclusion, a report from George. And we will also be hearing from Sandra Porteous from MNP, who's been helping us as we move forward with our DEI initiatives. Over to George and Sandra.
Okay, so as Rose identified, and Lisa last time, we had a process that focused on really 3 things in the initial year, which was doing a baseline survey, which we're going to talk about in a moment, but also establishing values and an affirmation statement of purpose, which we have started and engaged. Almost half of our staff have been directly involved in that activity. I'm proud to say, as I mentioned before, this is a very engaged staff who are committed to purpose and committed to improving the organization. So as Sandra will point out, we got a 90% participation rate in the first year of a baseline survey. I worked for the provincial government for a number of years. We did the baseline survey and then the updates. That's almost unheard of, seeing that kind of a participation rate. So I'll let Sandra speak to that more objectively. But I'm not going to go through each page, but what the bottom line summary is we're exceeding performance in terms of diversity and inclusion in certain categories. So we have more women than most organizations. We have more LGBTQ representation. We have Indigenous. In fact, we're probably underreporting on some of this because it's benchmarked against overall population as opposed to working population. So in some of these, once we in the future get, I've talked to Sandra about buying extra data because we should be comparing workforce to workforce. There's no sense, counting the 5, 10, 15-year-olds that are out in the population benchmarking because they're not in the workforce. So we'll have to break that out in more detail. The area that we definitely need to continue to look at, we have some disabilities in terms of representation. We do need to look at, are there opportunities for us to engage that community more for future hiring? And that goes back to the discussion we had even with Jeannie and Leslie. We need to look at, who are we reaching out to and what are the opportunities to improve on that? And then the visible minorities, and I'll talk a bit about my plan on some of that when we get into directors only and succession planning. But definitely, we have more representation at the lower levels, but obviously at the executive level, we have a lot of diversity. It's just not visible minorities. So as I said, in the other categories, we have very good representation all the way through, including senior management, but the visible minorities is one that we are continuing to target. And as I said before, one of the issues in the recruitment, and we've had some candidates that we thought would be great. They're not committing to us until we have that mandate review dealt with. So that mandate review and the roles and responsibilities that we talked about with Joe about Creatio and ourselves need to get resolved fairly quickly. Sandra, do you want to just give your objective view and highlight any of the key things? And obviously we'll be reviewing this, and Sandra and I agreed, in a small organization, we're not going to have big changes every year. So we are going to do the updates every 2 years. And, the key here is continuous improvement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll be very brief because I know you have a packed schedule. In essence, this really was a good news story. 90% participation in a demographic workforce survey that the organization has never run before. And again, deciding to run it, I always say, is somewhat brave in that once you have data, you're going to be looking for gaps and opportunities, and organizations that don't take this step don't really have a current snapshot of who's working for them. Again, with 100 people, there's not massive takeaways, but again, I was very interested to see how many different kinds of ethnicity exist within Waterfront. Again, 90% wanted to fill it out, which we have found at MMP during our time with Waterfront Toronto, highly engaged, values-based employees who overwhelmingly, even in our focus group, said, I work here because, and someone on the board mentioned this, I think earlier, this is important, substantive work, and I want to be part of it. Rahul, do you want to jump in? No, you want me to keep babbling? Okay, so there's always room for improvement. And so what the good news story is, as I said, as most of you know, the Ontario Human Rights Commission has always advocated doing this kind of work. And again, if you don't do it and don't understand that representation matters, you do miss out on attracting and retaining the best and the brightest. We've had great conversations with George and Rose about what are the next steps once you get the data. But just to remind people, it's year one baseline. It's the snapshot in time. And with so few vacancies in this organization, our recommendation, and George actually came up with it before we remembered to tell him, it really should be biannual. And again, it rolled out in April. People trusted the confidentiality of the survey. And again, I think that's why you have the 90%. So we're just trying to now develop strategies to address gaps and barriers. And to Leslie's point, part of the mandated work that MMP has been hired to do with HR is to start reviewing hiring and recruiting processes and where to post in sort of non-traditional places. So that's work that is going to begin in January. It's just not part of today's report.
I don't know if Rahul or anybody has comments or questions.
Thank you,
Sure.
Sandra.
Yep, quick comment. First of all, this is great. It's really a super snapshot to see as well. My comment's a slightly different perspective, and I'm going to look at page 40 itself, which is the impact part where it says we work purposely to make an impact. My comment is really about how people external to the organization, including stakeholders, could view some of the statements that come out of a very benign report. And what I'm driving at is, if you look at the first statement there, our duty is to serve all those who live, work, and play on the waterfront. You know, and we all know that our mandate is much bigger than just for those people who live, work, and play on the waterfront. And we have stakeholders that are contributing to us on that understanding as well. So I think we just need to be cautious about the excitement that we get about developing the waterfront doesn't in fact signal that we're just restricting our lens there. There's a much more broader value. And
so Rahul, I got to tell you, I've shared that comment. That was my comment to the group. This came bottom up, but I did say that they need to share back to staff the exact point that you made. Because that was my comment as well when I saw, and this was a bottom-up process that everybody.
And it's draft. It's draft right now.
Yeah, it is draft. And I'll just, George did give that exact comment when we showed him the draft. And what we said was, we wanted to make this a fully inclusive experience. And I've not seen this before. There were 2 committees that worked through the summer and on top of their regular jobs. And I had said this won't take much time, but they labored over every word. They debated. And then the 2 committees merged into one. And we did say, we think the purpose needs some work, but we're happy to show the draft. So Rahul, George, your words were echoed exactly. We knew this.
Comment.
Yeah.
So that's all good. And I get that, especially when there's a lot of excitement around it. But the point made, the second one in these 2 is, having gone through these processes, some of these statements I think are stronger if they're aspirational.
Yes.
So something like our projects are practical, innovative, and resilient. You know, they aim to be that.
Yeah.
Because they're going to be folks that don't take that position necessarily. And I know that from the bottom up, you know, by the time it gets to the top, this is the lens of the eyes we bring. So
Yeah.
I've got no issue with these things being aspirational, but
Yeah.
some of them, when they start to be too declarative and definitive
Yes.
of a statement, to me, I start to get a little uncomfortable. But anyhow, my point made, but the rest of it, I think it's just great. Good work.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that comment, because we kept using the word aspirational. And there were many changes made to the documents because people like to declare things that I respectfully, and as did others in the room, put up our hands and said, "Are you there yet?" No. Okay, well then let's change the language to say, to your point, that it's more aspirational. And we don't need to be there yet, but this is our goal. Okay, thank you.
And Rahul, one of the things when we had a town hall and we presented this and we said, you know, this is draft. I'm going to be presenting this to the board, and you know, the board will give us some insights as to things that we could improve on. But I do want it to go back through them so that they own it, right?
And we're working on 3 pieces. It's the purpose of Waterfront, the affirmation statement, and the values work that we've had staff engage in it. And so there is a lot of excitement, and we thank you for your comments. We definitely will go back.
Thank you for your time.
And any other questions for Sandra before she leaves the group from the committee?
No,
Okay.
thank you for having me.
Thanks, Sandra.
Have a good day.
Okay, so I think we will move to number 9 on the agenda, succession planning, from George, please.
Yeah, so I'll get into this in a little more detail when we get to directors only, as we start to potentially talk about individuals and their positions. We have been developing a succession plan in terms of we've actually required each of the executives to look at that as part of their PFS. So, and looking at, to our earlier discussion, reaching out to new untraditional groups. We are going to have, you know, one of the big challenges, as Sandra said, we're a small organization, so we don't have the opportunity to turn over and address some of the issues like equity and diversity as quickly as we would like in a large organization where you have a lot of turnover. But a turnover is an issue, and we want to make sure you have qualified people. So we're looking at both the diversity and the qualified individuals together as we look at succession planning. The only thing that we have to resolve, my biggest issue in particular, if we want to attract some top talent in both the executive but throughout the organization, is the mandate extension. That's the biggest issue. As I talked to some very qualified people that we've reached out to as potential successors, they said, well, I'm not going to, after working 25 years and reaching the pinnacle of my career, I'd love to come over and finish my career with Waterfront Toronto, but I'm not going to leave to only find out that your mandate's not extended. And then I have to start looking for a job again. So that's how critical that one piece is. So if we get it dealt with in the fall, that should address the potential succession that I have to plan for 2 years from now. And we have some turnover 2 to 5 years. That gives us a chance to plan properly, but we need to address some of those outstanding issues I raised earlier. And I'll get into individual discussions of positions and my thoughts on those later.
Thank you, George. We have a question from Joe.
Yes, thank you, Wendy. Just on the mandate extension, would you, in your crystal ball, is it likely, very likely, or a sure bet that this is going to be extended? And what I'm really trying to get at is, are we looking at what the, are you looking at, you looking at the possible threats to a mandate extension, what the arguments might be, different ways of structuring the work that other orders of government and parties might be thinking about? Yeah, so an assessment of how that might play, the different ways in which it might play out.
Well,
work as well.
I wish I had a crystal ball that would land all 3 governments on the same agenda item. There's different interests there. I would say certainly the federal government and the provincial have definitely, and even the mayor has said, you know, he believes in Waterfront Toronto. And there's no issue with regards to the extension. You know, we need to work out, as you said, Joe, what the roles between ourselves and Creatio are. So we've drafted that. I think they're waiting. The city in particular is waiting to see, you know, if we're going to put land in, because the rest of the land is city land pretty well. We need to know before we make any commitments to Waterfront Toronto, what the contributions of the other two levels of government are. I'll be speaking to that in a little more detail in directors only, so I can kind of elaborate on that. But I think it's been positive. I'm not saying it's a sure thing, but I would say that there's very positive feedback coming back. And when we met with 416 Caucus, they were very positive. I don't know, Cameron, you've been involved in some of the discussions with me, whether you classify it the same way.
I haven't heard any headwinds. I haven't heard anyone say, you know what, let's discuss this. I've heard very positive notions. The question will be under what terms and conditions.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, and I think, you know, quite frankly, you know, some levels of government are going to use this to make sure they get contributions by the other levels before they make, because that's the leverage, right?
That's very helpful. But and I would say you might want to do a kind of a SWOT. There's lots of good reasons, and there are some threats, I think, that that need to be thought through, so that you can engage those conversations with strength.
Yeah, I agree, and I must say I'm fully aware of what those threats are, but I won't speak to them.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. I think I hear you.
Thank you, Joe. And we have a question from Leslie, please.
Just taking back to the issue of the ambiguity of the challenge of recruiting with the degree of ambiguity there is, I just want to sort of put into context that I'm not sure that the degree of uncertainty in the status of the organization is any different than what's happening in other parts of the industry or the market because of what's happening in the economy. So not to state that it's not a problem, but I think put it into context, because I think there's other organizations facing similar situations. The details may differ. So the competition, it's not as, I'm trying to say it, I don't know how it's as severe as we might think it is, and we should approach the recruitment with that in mind, in the sense that ambiguity and uncertainty is around the private sector right now, less degree the public sector. In fact, one would argue that the public sector and a public agency, relatively speaking, has more stability than some other places. So just, I was just trying to put that into context, because I don't want us to think that this uncertainty is like the comments about the salary. There are other organizations facing similar things, so I think we should try to learn from them and the tactics they're applying as well.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you, Leslie, and we've talked about, you know, the opportunities that a change in the economy may actually have for us as well. And maybe what I'm speaking to is there's some high qualified individuals who are probably not at risk because of their talent. And they are interested in coming. So, you know, I'm probably just speaking to a smaller portion, but you're right. I mean, you know, we're not the only ones facing challenges, especially in the labor market that's tight right now.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions for George on the succession planning?
No, but just a comment. I don't think we're going to continue to see the labor market be tight. We're seeing a ton of layoffs in tech, and we tend to be the canary. So I would expect that we're going to see the relationship between the employees and the potential employers flip upside down the next couple of months, right? And I would also suggest that probably our talk track, you know, could be more positive about our future. I wouldn't join a company that's really consumed by our future. I think we got to believe that we're going to survive, and that's the only reason anybody would want to come and join on top of all the great projects you have on the go. That's all. That's only my comments on this. But great job. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Paul. Raul?
Yeah, just at the risk of piling on here, I think the uncertainty comments are all really good, but there are very few organizations out there that actually have a due date written down. So that's crystal clear in your mind when you're talking about it. And until we've got a better answer, until George has got confidence to be able to say to, you know, to high caliber individuals that that due date is not a hard due date, that's a tough conversation to navigate.
Yeah, thank you, Raul.
If I may just jump in really quickly, Raul, that's a very good point. When we interview, and this is, I've tried to share this philosophy with all our interviewee panels or hiring managers. We always talking about the passion that we're here about the project, the legacy we're leaving behind. It's not about the $1 million salaries at Waterfront Toronto, right? And we try to avoid anything relating to the mandate always. However, it has come up because people see that, they know what's going on. So we avoid it at all costs. Full steam ahead, but it does come up. I have to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, you know, as we said, we have a low turnover rate, partly because they believe in the organization. They think that everybody at the end of the day will see the value. But as Raul pointed out, when you have a firm date that you're confronting, that's a challenge.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Very good discussion. So we'll now move into item 10, governance documentation. And committee members will recall that at our last meeting, we spoke about a process to review our key governance documents. And there is a report contained in our materials, but after speaking with the committee chairs and our board chair and senior management, there doesn't appear to be any changes proposed at this time. And I would note that the review of the government documents is an ongoing process, and we'll bring this to the committee at any in terms of any changes that are identified in the future. Is there any discussion on this? No discussion? Okay, thank you very much. So before we go into our closed session, we wanted to extend our thanks to Councillor Joe Mihovic. Joe, we missed you at the very beginning of the meeting, and we just wanted to say what a pleasure it's been to work with you. And we understand that your term of office ends at the end of October, so this will be your last meeting with us. But we wanted to thank you very much for your contributions and for all of your support. And it's been terrific to have you on this committee, so just wanted to extend our thanks to you.
Well, thank you, Wendy. Actually, my term ends on Monday at 12 midnight. So I'm legitimately here today.
Yeah.
And I want to just, in response, also say thanks. This has been an exciting appointment. Frankly, it really was the cream of all the other boards that I sit on. Is frankly this one here. The work that Waterfront Toronto is doing is just so interesting and exciting, and I think it's a wonderful opportunity. It has been a wonderful opportunity for me to see all of that excitement and energy, and the kinds of projects are just, they're going to put us on the map globally, I think. And so I'm glad I was part of it. Yeah, it was a short ride, but it was a good ride, and I'm thankful for it. And I look forward to certainly watching and staying in touch as appropriate.
And if I could just say from management's perspective, Joe, you've been great to work with, and I have your phone number, so I have to tell you, you're not done yet.
Okay, and yes, George, I do want to also have a little offline conversation with you as well.
That's great.
Okay, cheers.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
It's only been 6 months since you joined right at the board retreat time when you were appointed, but you've been really marvelous, and I can't thank you enough for all your support and all your work on this committee.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we will have a motion to go into closed session. May I please have a motion to go into the closed session to discuss items 12 and 13 of today's agenda? Thank you, Raul. Thank you, Paul. So moved. Let's move ahead and go into closed session. And I just want to remind everyone that any resolution considered in a closed session also needs to be passed when the meeting returns to open session. Having concluded our discussion of the closed session items, I now ask for a motion to move back into open session. Is there a mover? Thank you, Raul. Seconder? Thank you, Joe. So moved. So let's move back into the open session. And so now we have returned to open session. We've resumed the recording of the session. May I please have a motion to approve the September 15th, 2022 committee meeting minutes? Is there a mover?
So moved.
Thank you, Raul. Thank you, Paul. So moved. Okay, so now can I have a motion to terminate the meeting? Having concluded the business of the meeting, I ask for a motion to adjourn. Is there a mover? Paul? Seconder, Joe? Any discussion? Okay, so moved. So now declare the meeting terminated. Thank you very much. And sorry to run over 20 minutes, everybody. I do think it was important discussion, and thank you very much for all of your support, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks.
Thanks
for letting me
and thank you, George and team.
Good work, George.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.